She stood at the edge of the shooting range, her hands steady but her eyes holding years of silence. No one knew her name, but everyone noticed the worn shoes, the thrift store jacket, and the look of someone who didn't belong. Whispers traveled, faster than gunshots. Why is she even here? This isn't a place for amateurs. She didn't flinch, didn't speak, just loaded her rifle like it was a sacred ritual. And in that moment, the wind itself seemed to pause, as if even the universe was holding its breath. The crowd barely looked up, just another misfit with dreams too big for her shoulders. But something about her silence felt dangerous, like the kind of quiet just before everything breaks. Rumors started curling through the cold air. She's never trained. Just a charity case. This'll be over in minutes. But as she raised the rifle, even the birds went silent. Because some silences don't mean fear. They mean warning. Beneath the harsh whispers, no one noticed the trembling hands that spoke of years spent alone, practicing in her small apartment, unable to afford a coach. They didn't see the bruises of doubt on her heart, or the way she clung to this one chance, her one shot, like it was all that mattered in the world. As the others laughed and made bets, no one could have predicted the truth, that sometimes it's the ones you overlook who end up heavier, the knowledge that no matter how hard she tried, the world would still never truly see her. As the first round of shots rang out, she took a deep breath, the sounds of the rifles echoing in her chest. Her hands were steady, but her mind raced. She knew she didn't have the same resources or training as the others. She didn't have the luxury of growing up in a family with connections or the comfort of attending the most elite shooting schools. All she had was years spent in the silence of her small apartment, the sound of her gunshots reverberating off the walls. Every evening she practiced alone, her only company the flickering light of a broken-down lamp and the echo but just barely outside the bullseye. It wasn't enough. She could feel the collective sigh from the audience, the look of disapproval in their eyes. Not good enough, they were thinking it. She could hear the mutterings, the judgments. It wasn't perfect, and she knew they expected perfection from someone like her. For a split second, she felt herself falter. The weight of their expectations pressed against her chest, pushing her down. Her hands trembled, the rifle feeling heavier in her grasp. Was this all a mistake? What if I never get this right? What if I'm just a joke to them? But then, something inside her shifted. She could still hear the whispers, but now they didn't hold the same power over her. In the silence between each shot, she found the clarity she needed. She wasn't competing for the crowd's approval anymore. She wasn't competing for anyone but herself. It wasn't about winning for them. It was about proving to herself that she had the strength to stand in a world that was always telling her she didn't belong. She wasn't just shooting at a target. She was shooting at every barrier, every doubt, and every word that had tried to hold her back. She could hear the echoes of the things people had said to her in the past. You'll never make it. You're too weak. Why even bother? But those words no longer held weight. With each shot, her focus deepened. She remembered the nights when she had stayed up late, trying to perfect her aim when the rest of the world was asleep. The sacrifices she had made, the hours spent practicing, alone in the cold, the doubts she had silenced to move forward. This was her moment, not theirs. It wasn't about being the best. It was about proving that she was enough, regardless of what anyone else thought. She took a deep breath and steadied herself. This time, when she fired, she didn't just aim for the target. She aimed for the feeling of self-belief she had long lost. She felt the shot before she even pulled the trigger, the certainty in her body, the confidence in her stance. The bullet tore through the air, and in the split second it took to reach the target, her heart stopped. She watched as it hit the bullseye with a precision that took her breath away. The silence that followed was deafening. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. The crowd, who had been so quick to judge, so quick to dismiss her, now stood in stunned silence. They didn't know what to say, how to react. She had done it. She had beaten every expectation, every stereotype, every limitation that had been placed on her. In that single shot, she had silenced every doubt, not just theirs, but her own as well. And then the applause came. It wasn't loud at first. It started small. One clap, then two, then a few more. But soon the entire crowd was on their feet, clapping, cheering, their faces filled with awe. She hadn't just won a competition. She had changed the way they saw her, and maybe, just maybe, the way they saw themselves. The silence that had once surrounded her now seemed like a distant memory, drowned out by the roar of appreciation and respect. As she stood there, the rifle still in her hands, her heart racing with a mix of disbelief and pride, she realized something. She had won, yes, but more importantly, she had found something she had been searching for her entire life. The strength to stand up for herself, the courage to believe when no one else did, and the power to silence every voice that had ever told her she wasn't good enough. This moment, smile. For the first time in years, she felt seen. She felt powerful. She had earned her place. But just as she was about to leave the range, a figure appeared from the shadows. Someone who had been watching the entire competition in silence. It was a man she didn't recognize. His face hidden behind the brim of a worn hat. His eyes sharp and calculating. "Not bad," he said, his voice low and calm. Almost too calm for someone who had just witnessed such a remarkable feat. She turned to face him, wary, instinctively tightening her grip on the rifle. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice steady but her mind racing. She didn't have time for strangers, not after everything she had just gone through. Her focus was finally back on her, the weight of the moment now resting solely on her shoulders. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a slow step forward, his gaze fixed on her with a kind of intensity that made her nervous. His silence was unnerving, like he knew something she didn't. "I've been watching you," he said quietly, his voice dripping with something that she couldn't quite place. "You've got talent, but that's not why I'm here." She felt a knot form in her stomach, a sense of unease creeping over her. "What do you mean?" she asked, though she could already sense that something was wrong. She wasn't ready for another challenge, not after everything she had already faced. Not after finally proving her worth. The man took another step forward, his eyes never leaving hers. "You think you've won?" he asked, his voice now tinged with something darker. "That shot, it wasn't your victory, it was mine." The words hit her like a punch to the gut, and for a moment she couldn't understand what he was saying. She blinked, trying to process his words. Her confusion quickly turned into anger. "What are you talking about?" she demanded. "I shot that bullseye. I earned this." The man finally revealed the truth, a truth that made her blood run cold. "You didn't shoot the bullseye," he said, his voice suddenly cold and hard. "I did." She stared at him, her mind racing, trying to make sense of his words. He continued, slowly, almost methodically, as though he was savoring her disbelief. "You think you won this competition fair and square, but you didn't. You were part of a setup. That shot wasn't yours. It was mine." Her heart skipped a beat. "No, you're lying," she whispered, but deep down she knew he wasn't. The pieces started to fall into place. The perfect shot. The way it felt so certain, so confident. It wasn't her. It had never been her. "You think I just let you take credit for my shot?" The man continued, a twisted smile curling at the edges of his lips. "You didn't win, girl. You were just a pawn in a game bigger than you." The words hit her like a hammer, each one shattering the illusion of her victory. She felt her legs weaken, her mind spinning as she tried to grasp the reality of what he was saying. How could this be? How could she have been so blind? The man stepped closer now, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I've been watching you for a long time. You've got fire, I'll give you that. But fire alone doesn't make a champion. A Champion understands the game. And you were never playing the game. You were just a piece on the board, a piece that I moved. She felt the world tilt around her. The victory she had fought for, the victory that had felt like her redemption, was nothing more than a lie. She hadn't defeated the best shooter in the country. She had been manipulated into thinking she had. The applause, the cheers, they were for nothing. She had played right into his hands. "I didn't do this," she whispered to herself, the words tasting bitter in her mouth. "I didn't win. I didn't earn this." The man smiled, but it wasn't a smile of triumph. It was the smile of someone who had seen it all before, someone who had orchestrated the very thing that had just shattered her reality. "No," he said, his voice soft but final. "You didn't." For a moment, she stood there, numb, trying to piece together the fragments of her shattered confidence. The air around her felt thick, suffocating. The cheers from the crowd felt like a distant memory, a cruel echo of something she could never claim as her own. But then, in that silence, something inside her sparked. Something deeper than all the manipulation, all the lies, all the broken pieces. She didn't need this man to validate her. She didn't need anyone's approval, not now. She wasn't going to let this twist define her. Her eyes hardened, the fire in her that had been dampened flaring up once more. "I don't need your games," she said, her voice sharp, filled with a newfound strength. "I'm not your pawn. You can take your twisted little victory and shove it. I'll beat you, on my own." The man's smile faltered for the first time, and for a moment, there was uncertainty in his eyes. But before he could respond, she turned on her heel and walked away. Every step was In the silence between their words, the reality of the past few years flooded her mind like a storm. The late nights, the isolation, the sacrifices no one had ever seen. She thought of her mother, who had always believed in her, but who never understood why her daughter spent so much time alone, shut in a tiny apartment with nothing but the sound of her rifle and the weight of her dreams. Every conversation had ended in a forced smile from her mother, who tried so hard to hide her worry behind her laughter. "You've always been strong, honey, but don't forget to live too." Her mother's words echoed in her head, but she hadn't known how to explain. How could she tell her that every time she pulled the trigger, she wasn't just shooting at a target? She was shooting at the life she'd never had, the joy she'd never known. How could she tell her that this was her escape? There were times when her hands shook with exhaustion, nights when she barely slept, her mind constantly replaying every detail of her technique, every flicker of doubt in her form. But the world outside didn't know that. The people she passed by every day, the ones who judged her before she even had a chance to speak, didn't know what it was like to give up everything, for a chance at a dream that seemed too far out of reach. Her mind flicked back to the times she'd skipped meals to save money for ammunition, the times she'd missed the phone calls from friends who had long since stopped asking why she couldn't come out, the times she had turned down every offer to hang out or to just be normal. Her youth had slipped away, each year vanishing as she poured everything into her skill, into the belief that this moment would come, that this moment would be worth it. She thought about the loneliness, the weight of it all, the isolation she'd accepted as part of the cost of becoming who she was. Every time she had shown up at the range, every time she had practiced at midnight in a small, dimly lit room, it was her silent sacrifice. She had sacrificed life, the easy kind, the normal kind, for something that no one could see, for something that no one would understand. The doubt in her family's eyes when she explained why she was always alone, why she couldn't join them. The unanswered text messages. The birthdays spent training instead of celebrating, and no one had ever asked her why. No one had ever asked how much it hurt to stand alone while everyone else built connections, made memories, lived their lives. The world never saw the quiet desperation behind the smile she forced onto her face when people asked why she was always so serious, always so distant. No one had known the sleepless nights, the moments of almost giving up, and the unbearable ache in her chest when she questioned if it was all worth it. Would they even care if I failed? But she hadn't failed. She had pushed through the pain, through the exhaustion, through every sacrifice. She had fought to be here, to stand in this very place and prove that she was worth something, that she had gained something far more valuable, the truth that she was the only one who could define her worth. And as the man watched her leave, he saw something in her that he hadn't expected, something that couldn't be manipulated, something that couldn't be taken. It was the quiet power of someone who had already won, long before the competition had started. The moment she had stepped onto the range, there was an invisible weight that pressed down on her shoulders, a pressure she had learned to live with. It wasn't just about winning, proving herself, or even silencing the voices that had whispered doubts in her ears for so long. No, this was about something far deeper. This was about protecting the one thing she had left: her self-worth, her identity, the quiet space she had carved out in the world where no one could define her except herself. Every breath she took, every calculated shot she made, was an act of protection. The men and women around her, with their glossy rifles and polished uniforms, didn't understand that. To them, it was just a competition. But for her, it was about defending her place, not just in this arena, but in life itself. Every whisper that cut through the air, every judgmental glance from those who didn't think she belonged, was another reason to stand taller, to push harder, and to refuse to back down. Her fingers wrapped tighter around the rifle, her grip firm, steady. The crowd around her might have seen her as just another competitor, just another woman trying to prove herself. But she wasn't just anyone. She was a woman who had spent years protecting herself from the cruelest of judgments, years fighting, to be seen, to be taken seriously, when everyone told her she didn't have what it took. She had spent countless nights alone, confronting her doubts, her fears, her insecurities. But it wasn't just about the internal battles anymore. It was about the external ones, too. She couldn't afford to let herself be overlooked again. She couldn't afford to let herself be dismissed, ridiculed, or ignored. Not anymore. The silence that she once allowed to smother her was now the very thing that gave her strength. In this silence, she could hear her heartbeat, steady and certain, like the ticking of a clock marking the time until she would prove herself. Her determination surged, filling her chest like a fire, each beat an affirmation of her resolve. But it wasn't just for her. It was for the quiet girl who had been overlooked, dismissed by everyone in her life who thought they knew what she was capable of. It was for the child who had watched as people walked over her dreams without a second thought. It was for the woman who had buried her hopes in the face of constant failure, knowing that there would never be another chance if she didn't fight for it now. Then, where she was never told she couldn't. As the man she had been up against took his shot, she felt her chest tighten. The pressure in the air intensified, each second stretching into eternity. She watched as his bullet flew, hitting the target with expert precision. There was no surprise. Now she was determined to hold onto it. Her hands lowered the rifle, her jaw clenched, and in that moment, she knew that nothing, not a man's twisted words, not the judgments of the crowd, not even her own insecurities, would ever take that away from her. The silent sacrifice had led her here, and now, her protective, determined heart would carry her forward, not just through this competition, but through every battle she would face from this day forward. As the competition wore on, something gnawed at her from within, an old, familiar feeling that she had pushed down for so long. She had been so focused on proving herself, on protecting the identity she had carefully crafted, that she had never taken a moment to reflect on the cost of that journey. It wasn't until the final round, when everything seemed to culminate, in that one intense moment, that the weight of it all hit her. It wasn't the pressure of the competition that rattled her. It was the realization of what she had left behind. The friendships she had neglected, the people she had distanced herself from, the opportunities for connection that had slipped through her fingers. The more she thought about it, the more the bitter taste of regret filled her mouth. Had it all Been worth it? She thought back to the times when she could have called her mother, when she could have joined her friends for a simple dinner or a fun outing, but she had always chosen the target, the rifle, the quiet isolation of training. She had told herself it was for the greater good, that this messages from friends who had tried to reach out. Could she ever repair the damage she had caused? The shot rang out, sharp, clear, and perfect. But as the sound faded, the emptiness remained. She had won, but at what cost? It was only later, when the adrenaline had subsided and the excitement of victory had faded into a dull ache, that she realized something. There was more to winning than just hitting the target. The true victory would be in facing her regrets, in doing the hard work of repairing the broken relationships and reconciling with herself. She had spent so long running from her past mistakes that she had never given herself the opportunity to make things right. The first step toward redemption came when she picked up the phone and called her mother. The conversation started awkwardly, the distance between them palpable. But as they spoke, something shifted. Her mother's voice, full of love and understanding, began to bridge the gap that had formed between them. "I'm proud of you, honey," her mother said softly. "But don't forget that you're more than just your accomplishments. You've always been enough, just as you are." Her heart ached at the simplicity of those words, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to believe them. She didn't have to be perfect. She didn't have to sacrifice everything for a dream. What mattered was the personality that came from the heart. "I pushed you all away because I was scared," she confessed. "Scared that I wouldn't be good enough unless I sacrificed everything. But I've realized I've been wrong." With each apology, with each step forward, the burden on her heart lightened. It wasn't that the past could be undone, but it could be acknowledged. It could be made right through the actions that followed. Redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about facing it with courage and grace, and taking responsibility for the mistakes that had been made. The final piece of her redemption came when she stood at the range again, not as a competitor, but as someone who had learned to balance her passion with the things that truly mattered. She didn't need to be the best shooter in the world to be enough. She didn't need to win every competition to feel validated. What mattered was the connection she had rebuilt, the relationships she had nurtured, and the person she was becoming. Someone who knew that redemption wasn't found in a single moment of triumph, but in the quiet, steady work of living a life that aligned with her truest self. Her hands were still steady as she aimed the rifle one final time, but this time, it wasn't just about the perfect shot. It was about making peace with her past, embracing the imperfections, and knowing that redemption was not a destination, but a journey. And for the first time in a long time, she felt at peace with herself. The competition had reached its final stage, and the atmosphere was electric. The air was thick with anticipation, and every pair of eyes in the crowd was focused on the target ahead. This wasn't just another round of shots. It was the culmination of everything she had worked for. Every single breath she took felt heavier than the last. The sound of the ticking clock in the background was the only noise she could hear, each second stretching on indefinitely, each tick marking her fate. As she adjusted her grip on the rifle, a surge of doubt rushed through her. What if I'm not good enough? What if this is where I fail? The voices that had once whispered in the back of her mind now seemed deafening. She had spent years building her reputation, training tirelessly for this moment, yet here she was, standing on the precipice, unsure of whether she could deliver when it mattered the most. She looked to her right, and for the briefest moment, her eyes locked with his, the man she had been competing against throughout the event. His gaze was unwavering, filled with confidence, a quiet certainty that stung her deeper than any words ever could. He was the best, the national champion, the one she had been told would be impossible to beat. Could she really pull this off? She thought of all the sacrifices she had made, the lonely hours spent training, the pain, the doubts, and the emotional toll it had taken on her. And yet, here she was, on the verge of achieving what many said was impossible. The clock continued to tick down, and a heavy silence fell over the range. The audience, once murmuring excitedly, had fallen into a hushed stillness, their breath collectively held in suspense. Every eye was locked on her, expecting, hoping, waiting. She felt the pressure build, constricting her chest, tightening. Her grip. The very weight of the moment seemed unbearable. Her heart pounded in her ears. If I miss, I'll never live this down. They'll say I wasn't good enough. That I didn't belong here. The pressure could have crushed her, but instead, it sparked something inside her. A memory. A moment that had defined her. A conversation with her mother years ago, when she had been struggling with self-doubt. It's not about whether you win or lose, her mother had told her. It's about showing up when it's hard. It's about pushing forward no matter how many times you fail. Because the real victory lies in believing in yourself when everyone else doesn't. Her fingers tightened around the rifle's trigger, the cold metal now feeling like an extension of herself. In that moment, a strange peace washed over her. The weight of expectation and pressure didn't disappear, but it no longer consumed her. She had already won, not because of the outcome of this shot, but because she had made it this far. She had pushed through the toughest of times, fought the hardest battles, and survived when so many had counted her out. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. She remembered her mother's words, and in that instant, she found clarity. This is what I've worked for. She wasn't just here to win for herself. She was here to show everyone, including herself, that she was capable of more than they could ever imagine. She wasn't just a woman who picked up a rifle, she was a force to be reckoned with. With the focus and precision that had been ingrained in her through years of training, she released the shot. The competition was over, and the final results were announced, but the true victory had already taken place, not on the podium, but within herself. As the crowds dispersed, leaving behind echoes of applause and congratulations, she stood there, silent, almost in a trance, looking out over the range where her shot had landed perfectly. It wasn't just a flawless shot that made her a champion today. It was the journey, the path she had walked alone, filled with doubt and pain, but also with strength and resilience. Now, as she looked at the target, something deep inside her settled into a sense of clarity. The long hours of training, the isolation, the pressure, and the endless sacrifices had all led her to this very moment. But more importantly, they had led her to an understanding she hadn't possessed before. Winning was never about beating someone else. It wasn't about proving her worth or seeking validation. It was about facing her own fears and doubts, pushing past them, and believing in her ability to rise above them. She looked down at the rifle in her hands, once a symbol of endless striving, of a pursuit that had cost her more than she had ever been willing to admit. But now, it was a symbol of something else: self-empowerment. The struggle had been her teacher, and in the end, it had shaped her into someone stronger, wiser, and more self-aware than she had ever been. For the first time, she realized that the true victory was the transformation she had undergone. She was no longer just the girl who sought approval or ran from failure. She was the woman who had embraced her vulnerabilities, learned from her regrets, and stepped into her future with renewed purpose. The fear and anxiety that had once defined her were no longer chains holding her back. They had become the fuel for her growth, propelling her toward a future that was no longer clouded by doubt or regret. As she walked off the range, her head held high, she felt the warmth of the sunlight on her face. For the first time in years, it wasn't just the physical heat that made her feel alive. It was the warmth that came from within. There was a sense of clarity in her heart, an understanding that she had reached a place of peace with herself. She no longer felt the need to prove anything to anyone. Her worth was not tied to her achievements, but to who she had become in the process of achieving them. Hope blossomed within her, like a seed planted in fertile soil, ready to grow into something beautiful. There were still challenges ahead, still uncertainties to face, but she now understood that those challenges were simply another part of the journey. They were no longer things to fear. They were things to embrace. With every setback came an opportunity to learn. With every failure came a chance to rise stronger. And with every victory, no matter how small, came the knowledge that she was capable of facing whatever life threw her way. She glanced back toward the range, one last time, before turning her gaze to the horizon. The world felt vast, and her place within it no longer felt like a question she needed to answer. She had found peace with herself. The sense of hope that had been elusive for so long now seemed like an undeniable truth. She was ready for whatever came next, knowing that the strength to face it was already within her. The final words echoed in her mind, her mother's voice from so many years ago. It's not about whether you win or lose. It's about being true to yourself, even when it's hard. And now she understood what that truly meant. She had been true to herself through every trial, every moment of doubt. She had stayed the course, not because of the rewards that came from others, but because of the inner strength she had discovered. She was a woman who had learned to believe, not just in her abilities, but in herself. That was the true prize. The world was wide and full of possibilities, and with that clarity and hope, she knew her journey was only just beginning.